the right to keep and bear arms is something that can really get some folks agitated. Because the idea in our constitutional system is that the right to keep and bear arms reflects who's boss. The government, and I had a debate this morning with a radio talk show host from Center City, Milwaukee, and he thought that the government gave us the Constitution. Hopefully you've been here long enough, even in this camp, that you realize that the government didn't give us anything.
Right.
We created the Constitution, which in turn created the government.
Right.
The government, constitutionally speaking, is a creature. And politically speaking, it is not the boss. We the people are, because we the people created the Constitution which set up the government. That idea doesn't go down well in many government centers, be it a county seat or a state capital or in our nation's capital. Policymakers, politicians really don't like to be reminded of the fact that all us average schlubs that are just walking around out there are their boss.
Right.
That really irritates them. So we just have to be prepared for that they don't really get it, and they often have an attitude.
Yeah.
And we have to learn to deal with that and try to do so as gently as possible, but to get the point across to them that there is a priority here. Actually, the clearest depiction of what I'm talking about I saw in the Philippines. I was there several years ago, and I visited with the head of the army, General Isleta. And behind him, on the wall behind him, was a placard, I guess we could call it, almost like a stiff bumper sticker that said, "Jesus is Lord." And I said, "Oh, I like that." And he said, "Well, yes, that's part of it." And he said, "Now you'll notice that right under that, where it says Jesus is Lord, we have a picture of our president, who at the time was Corazon Aquino." And he said, "Then I'm here." So he said, that's the line of command for the army. God, the president, and then me. Now I thought that's extraordinary that a military officer of that rank especially would understand that well. I would hope that all American Army military officers understand that concept as well. In fact, I wish all of our public servants understood it as well. That was a really concise statement of the proper ordering of government. Oftentimes the point of view that I'm espousing is referred to as those of us who think this way are called bitter clingers. And that was the phrase that was used so famously, or infamously as you may prefer, by our former president, who when he was campaigning, I believe it was in the state of Pennsylvania, he was asked how it was going, and he said, "Well, I'm having trouble with those bitter clingers who all they want to talk about is their Bible and their guns." And that's why Pennsylvania is still, in spite of its two large urban centers, is still a state that can go either way politically, because there are a whole lot of people in Pennsylvania that understand that line of command. And oh, does it irritate some of the politicians. We sometimes hear commentators describe politicians who kind of lose it as becoming unhinged. And one of the things that I've thought about doing as an act of compassion is to, I should have had them this morning, except I was just on the radio. It wasn't personal appearance, but I think it would be very suitable when we're in contact with people like that, to have a box of hinges that we've gotten from the hardware store, and when they start losing it, we offer to let them use one of the hinges so they can become rehinged because they so often become unhinged. So, what did that guy from Washington talk about? He talked about hinges. So, one of the basic challenges that we face at Gun Owners of America is the idea, which is quite shared among too many Republicans as well as most Democrats, is that, without putting it in these terms, these are my words, but they look at themselves as in the elite. Now, they don't really have a way of explaining why they're in the elite and you and I are not, but that's their view, that somehow, and they certainly couldn't tell you that God put them there, because very seldom do they have any belief that God does anything. What God? I never saw him. What are you talking about? But they somehow know that magically, whatever, they were born to rule and we were born to be ruled. And that's an attitude that very frequently pervades government centers. And it's one that you've got to know about. They don't put it, usually they don't put it quite as clearly as I'm trying to put it right now, but that is their view of government, which is clearly departed from this line of command that I saw in an Asian foreign country, which seemed to have a better understanding of it than a lot of politicians in, say, Chicago, just to pick an American jurisdiction out of the air. Excuse me. One of the things that's been most encouraging in our effort to put these ideas before centers of government power has been, in a number of jurisdictions, we've got counties, and I suspect there might even be one or two or three in Massachusetts, a number in New Hampshire. In fact, these three New England states of Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont are constitutional carry states. And they've made a decision, which I think is politically, maybe not all at once, and it may take some time to be manifest, but they've made a decision that anybody in the state can carry a concealed firearm without any government permission whatsoever. That's normally referred to as constitutional carry. There are a dozen or more states that now have laws like that. And surprisingly enough, Vermont has had it since really forever. And now Maine and New Hampshire do as well as many other states in the country. And it's an idea that seems to be catching hold. It's not something that happened a long time ago, and those are the only 12 or 13 states that have constitutional carry. But this is something that now is being debated and promoted in state legislatures all around the country. One of the leading proponents of this is a sheriff in Indiana, Elkhart County Sheriff Brad Rogers. And I'm happy to say he's one of our life members. So he got a hold of one of these babies and signed up not just for a year membership, but he actually signed up for life. And he's a fairly young guy, so we're on the hook to him for quite a bit. Sheriff Rogers came to our attention, and I would say the constitutional carry movement's attention and many of the constitutional government advocates' attention when he was approached by an Amish farmer. Now, you may or may not know, but typically the Amish do not vote. They don't approve of the political system. They just want to be out. Their theology tells them that they shouldn't have anything to do with politics. And yet here was this Amish farmer coming in to see the elected sheriff of Elkhart County, Indiana. And the farmer said that he was being set upon by the Food and Drug Administration. I'll make sure I get the right agency, because it could have been two or three others in none of us would have known the difference. But the Food and Drug Administration was after this poor guy because, make sure you're sitting down, he was selling raw milk across state lines.
No.
No, it certainly offended the folks in Washington at the FDA, and they were on the verge of taking him into court, and he was afraid that they were going to grab his equipment in settlement for any losses that might be imposed into court. So trouble was certainly looking him in the face, and so he went to see Sheriff Rogers. And Sheriff Rogers did his due diligence. He went out to the farm to make sure that he's not getting involved with the little house of horrors or something. You know, as you might expect, anybody that's selling non-heated, non-pasteurized milk is going to be running a very clean operation, and that was the case in this farmer's situation. So Rogers went back to his office and sent an email. You can tell it's a modern story. Sent an email off to the head attorney at the Food and Drug Administration, and he said, I don't want you doing any more inspections on this man's property, and in fact, if you do, I'll put you in my jail. This is one of those strong letter to follow stories. And so this gal writes back to him and says, well, if you do that, we'll put you in jail. And in so many words, these are not direct quotes, Sheriff Rogers said, game on. He will see them on the farmer's property if need be. And the end of the story, and this is now, I think, about 4 years, that was the end of the matter. And he got reelected recently, so this is probably at the bottom of their to-do list now, because one county sheriff said, it really doesn't impress me that you're from the federal government because you don't have authority. Now that's a 4-letter word in Washington. Joe Biden thinks 4-letter words have 3 letters. But, have you heard that sound clip where he talked about all these 4-letter words that we've got to be dealing with, like job? Well, you know, the poor guy, he's been struggling for a long time. But as a result, the raw milk is still being sold over the line in Michigan to a number of co-ops. And interestingly enough, there haven't been any accounts of people becoming sick as a result of consuming this milk. I've heard of people getting sick from many other things, but not as a general rule. I don't think there are many examples at all of people being made sick from raw milk. And I imagine if they left it out for a couple of weeks on their counter, that might have a problem, but try doing that with any bottle of milk. So anyway, this is what a county sheriff in most states can do. Now, Connecticut did away with their system of sheriffs, and some states have pretty much neutered the office, but I would say probably, well, let's see, the President Obama at one time said that he visited 51 states and he had 7 to go, I think it was. But, and 45 of the 50 states, by my reckoning, anyway, and I'm not as smart as he, so I'll just have to go on my recollection. When I was studying, it was 50 of us at the time. The matter seems to be pretty clear, and sheriffs in most of these states are the top cop. And so if there's a situation involving the Bureau of Land Management, sheriffs in those situations here and there in counties across the country have stood up to the federal government and said, you're not going to go there. You're not going to be able to do that. Environmental Protection Agency, the sheriff in southern Oregon in Josephine County had a situation where there were people with their own forests who tend to be much more respectful of their private property than government-managed public lands. And he had a similar situation to that of Sheriff Rogers, where he had to stand up to the feds on a land use issue, the Bureau of Land Management. I think this was the Forestry Department and Department of Agriculture. All of these federal agencies and bureaus and offices have their own police departments. There was a woman who got behind in her college loans. And most college loans, well, let's say frequently college loans are underwritten by the federal government. And so ultimately, if you don't pay your loans off, you may get into trouble with the federal government. And this gal, I guess, had a big loan and she was quite behind. And at one moment she looks out and there's a SWAT team outside her domicile. And they had come to make sure she paid off her college loans. So if you're thinking of going to college, you might want to keep that in mind. So, I guess the thing that bothers a lot of liberals, a lot of people who really think the government should be in charge of about all the decisions that we make, and because if they do have that point of view, they have a very low opinion of the level of responsibility of most Americans. They need to be regulated. They need to be supervised. They need to have Big Brother, if you will, watching over them. And you may have heard of an, at one point it was a very famous novel. 1984 it was a novel about Big Brother. It was written by a British socialist who became disillusioned with communism. He'd been involved in the Spanish Civil War back in the 1930s, and he had written this book to show just how horrible the future could be when all power ends up in the hands of the government. A government that is over all other branches of government is basically a supreme government. It becomes very frightening and very dangerous. And even without the surveillance technology that we have of our day, George Orwell, the author of 1984, was quite ahead of his time. He had the television depicted as the monitoring device for whatever was going on in somebody's apartment. And so Big Brother was always watching you, and that was one of the slogans that was very often repeated in his dystopian future, his negative utopia, if you will, his very gloomy utopia, sometimes called dystopia, of 1984. But most liberals think, well, that's not going to apply in our case. And in fact, there's a rather well-known time when both of these men are now deceased, but a very well-known economist, Milton Friedman, at that time from the University of Chicago, had testified in front of a Senate committee chaired by Senator Edward Kennedy. And Dr. Friedman went through a list of countries, very quickly, but very clearly, that had tried socialism and it had failed. And the result had been poverty, the result had been tyranny, suffering, arbitrary incarceration, mass killings by the government. Other than that, it was fine. That was, when he got to the end of his list, Senator Kennedy said, well, that's because they hadn't had the right people in charge. And a lot of socialists have that arrogance. They assume that they, to coin a phrase, are the ones we've been waiting for. You may or may not remember that from President Obama's campaigning, but in 2008, that was one of his slogans. We're the ones we've been waiting for. And of course, it really meant, I'm the one you've been waiting for. I, the Messiah, have arrived. And a lot of times, politicians gone amok really do have a kind of messianic complex. Right. And they want to use the government as the instrument of bringing in the end of time. Well, it may be the end of time for a lot of their victims, but it's not the end of history. Hasn't been yet. And that, I think, is one of the goalposts, the two different points of view that Dr. Friedman was one of the best-known free market economists of the last century, and Senator Kennedy was one of the best-known socialist politicians in the United States of the last century. Ran as a Democrat, but he was a socialist. There were a lot of other things that weren't very nice about him. We could get into those at some other time, but there wasn't much of an evident fear of God in the man, and so he had a way of living and behaving that belied the fact that he had any fear of what was going to come in the next life. Another trait of many socialists is that they assume that they're the ones that can manage the future to the end of time. And aren't you lucky to be living while they're in charge? Sometimes we've said no in a very forceful fashion. And that's actually what happened in America in the 18th century. The British just assumed that they had the right to rule. After all, we had come, most of us, from Britain, and we came with the English system of laws and traditions and language, but we didn't all come with the same religion. That's why most of our forebears came here. If they came from Britain, they were trying to get away from the king and the official religion of England. And that has really kind of set the tone for America from that very time. You see, other countries have access to guns. Citizens have access to guns. It's been estimated that perhaps a quarter of some Scandinavian countries, such as Norway, the population owns their own firearms and has them at home. My wife grew up in Panama, and many people there own firearms. And there are other countries in the world where people own firearms, sometimes even kept in their homes. But there's a tradition that I am aware of only that's at all current here in our United States. The Swiss, for some time, had this tradition I'm going to point to in just a second, but they've lost it. They're pretty much like the rest of Europe now, where they assume that the government has the last word on important decisions in our life. But here in the United States, not only do we own firearms, and many Americans own a lot of firearms, we have the tradition of telling the government, you've gone too far. We have our guns as a firewall to keep you in place. You want to offend a politician? Remind him of that. They'll accuse you of insurrection, of all, which is kind of you're violating my authority. Well, they don't have unlimited authority. They have authority granted them by the people under the terms of the Constitution. And that really irritates people who are rebellious. I remember years ago, decades ago, we put out a news release. I believe it was dealing with something that President Clinton was doing, and we referred to the rebellion of his administration. And a New York Times reporter called and said, "What kind of nonsense is this? Governments aren't ever in rebellion." Well, as it turned out, he had no concept of God and Constitution and public servants in that order, in that pecking order, in that line of command. And so he thought what I was talking about was nonsense. Of course, what he was talking about was constitutionally the greatest nonsense and very dangerous nonsense, because if it were left to him, we'd live in a dictatorship. But because by God's grace we are here in America, we've been given this gift of a notion of government that pretty much doesn't exist in practice in any other place in the world. And I've traveled to a lot of other countries. I've been to Africa, I've been to Europe, I've been to Asia. I speak Spanish. My wife and I speak Spanish at home. I'm well aware of other cultures and their traditions. And I can tell you from my own experience, we are in the most unusual country in the world. This truly is an exceptional country. And it's really sad when we see people like our former president, but many others. I'm just singling him out because he kind of volunteered to be singled out. He really doesn't like that kind of talk because he comes from a communist point of view. His mother had married a Kenyan communist. And now I know some people will dispute his, but let's just take the common hagiography, the common notion of how we got Mr. Obama. His mother was an atheist from birth. Her parents were basically godless people, and they didn't like the United States. And she acted upon that training and married a guy who was not at all a believer. In fact, hated the West because he'd lived in what had been a colony of Britain, Kenya, and he imported that hatred of the West, which he found so agreeably shared by his then wife. Well, he skipped out on some college loans and went back to Kenya, which is another thing that you see characteristic among, not exclusively, but many times socialists don't feel themselves responsible to pay things. That's why they have their hands in the till, because otherwise they'd have to work for their money. And it's so much easier, they think, to just take it, because they have a right to do that, because they're ruling, correct? Remember that. If they're in office, they have the right to tell us what to do, take the money that they might find necessary. So then she married a guy from Indonesia, and the formative years of President Obama were spent in Indonesia. Now, he's been clever enough, in my opinion, never to utter a word in that second language of his, but I'm rather certain that because of those ages, and because I'm around a lot of Hispanics, the church I go to speaks Spanish, and I see how easily kids can learn a foreign language, can learn English. They can get off the boat, as it were, and 3 months later, they're speaking English like a native if they're young enough. And so here you've got, I'm sure Barack Obama knows how to speak the language of Indonesia where he was living. He's been clever enough not to push that in our face, but he was there in this country where his formative years, not only was it at a time when he's speaking another language, but the way of thinking about government and the relationship of God and law and rulers was so different, still is to this day. And so it's not surprising that we had so much trouble dealing with President Obama, because his formative years were those of a mother who was a communist, who was a friend, well, not a personal friend, but a supporter of Castro's communist Cuba. She had been publicly identified with that movement. Everything about her was of the left. And the Indonesian experience couldn't have been much different. And so we can see how important ideas are. And the young Obama never, as far as I can tell from everything I've read about him, never had an opportunity to learn what America is really like.
Right.
And somehow we managed to elect a guy who not only did not understand America, but really had a cold, furious hatred of America.
Right.
And did a lot of damage and a lot of destruction. We've simply got to continue and build upon these traditional historical ideas of what America is. We are an exceptional country, and when you see somebody cringe when you talk about why we are an exceptional country, you know there's somebody that maybe you want to spend a little bit more time talking to. Don't declare them an enemy. Don't get in their face a la Obama. That's his brand of dealing with people. But you do realize that there's a mission field. There's somebody who doesn't get it. And you have an opportunity to share with them and to show them the better way from that which they evidently hold to. It's not surprising because so many of our schools, I don't have to tell you, many of you I understand are being homeschooled, but you know plenty of people who are in the government schools, and unless their parents are very vigilant, it's going to be very difficult for those kids to have an idea, anything like what I'm talking about right now. You've been here and kind of busy doing what you're doing, so you may not have seen the news about, I guess it's called a narrative, but somebody had photoshopped, used some photographic sleight of hand, if you will, and they made a picture, looked like it might be a real picture, that's how good it was, of Donald Trump on the ground just wailing away at this guy whose head had been photoshopped out, and it had the CNN logo, the news network, or we might say the fake news network's logo.
Communist News Network.
Or somebody might even want to call it the Communist News Network. The word fake news network may not fit CNN as well, but it certainly helps explain what they've been up to for a long, long time. And the media reacted to that depiction, to that photographic creation, as if their lives were now in danger. That this was an invitation to violence against the media. Frankly, because it's my job, I spend a lot of time looking at what the media talks about, what they promote, and I never saw anything from the mainline media criticizing one little bit about she's called a comedian. I didn't think she's very funny, but she had pulled up a head of Donald Trump, all bloodied, as if it had been cut off sort of a la Muslim style. And nobody in the media had a peep about that was going to lead to violence against Republican politicians or the president himself. Actually, there was a Republican politician that almost got killed because of that kind of attitude among too many in the left, where they have been so frustrated dealing with folks like us in the field of ideas that they resort to violence. They believe that they are entitled to resort to violence, that this is something that they should be doing. And so up comes this head of Donald Trump, a severed head, blood all over. You can just barely tell that it's the president's likeness. Not a peep from the media about that. But the Photoshop of Trump whooping away on somebody from CNN with the CNN logo for a head, now that was scary, we were told by the media. I bring this up partly to show that they really are full of their double standards. In fact, perhaps my favorite talk show host is a guy in Washington called Chris Plant. And one of his favorite sayings, and he gets to use it appropriately at least once a day, well, without double standards, the liberals would have no standards at all. And so I've just given you an example of the liberals. So we have seen all kinds of frenzied objection to this picture of Donald Trump whooping away on CNN. It was created by a young man, 15 years old. So I put this out as a challenge to you because I would imagine some here at 15, above and below, but around that age, you see what you can do? You can absolutely command the national narrative with one, in this young man's case, just one clever bit of photographic editing. And he put on display the hypocrisy, the double standards of so many of the liberals. It was a sight to behold. They're still kind of getting over it, because this has just happened. So there are some enjoyable things in the news if you know where to look for them. But if you don't have a strong stomach, you may want to limit that to a certain time a day. One of the things that's sometimes said, even now, about the Second Amendment and the average American owning a gun is, what do you think you can do against a national government, a federal government that's got, what do they call them, warthogs? They're a special kind of gunship that are pretty fearsome. They can come in and drop bombs and different kinds of machine guns, and they can blow things up and shoot them into smithereens. It's an awesome war machine. And that's just one weapon in the arsenal that the American military has.
Talking about Black Hawk?
No, that's another generation. You're showing your age. This is very modern. It looks kind of like an angry bull.
It's an A-10.
The A-10 is the actual numeric designation for it, and it's got some sort of a nickname, and I think hog is
Warthog.
Warthog. I guessed right. Okay.
It's armed.
So what do we do? What can we do with a semi-automatic rifle, perhaps, against that kind of weaponry, which is truly amazing in its power? And consider this. Now, if we're stuck on stupid, there wouldn't be much we could do about it. But consider that the very same argument was being made against the 18th century American shopkeeper and farmer who was talking about putting an end to British tyranny in America. What do you think a bunch of you yeomen, peasants, working people, I think the Marxists call us workers today, what do you think you can do against the world's most powerful military, which at the time came out of London, but today we'd have to say comes out of Washington? Well, the British got an answer as to what we could do with our muskets and our brown bess rifles and our Indian-style military tactics that they didn't know how to cope with. So there's always a wrinkle that can change the equation, and it's up to us to whether it's politically, militarily, or whatever, find that wrinkle and make sure that it gets applied. And I would say one of the wrinkles that got applied recently was that 15-year-old who is just driving liberals crazy with his photoshopped image of the president whooping on a guy called CNN. That's having real impact. It's further unmasking the media for their dishonesty, that they didn't say anything about the comedian holding up the likeness of Donald Trump's severed head. That was just funny. But beating up a guy that doesn't even look like a guy because his head is actually the logo for CNN, well, that's not funny. That's really scary. That's going to lead to violence against the media. And so, again, without double standards, the liberals wouldn't have standards at all. And so, everywhere you look, you can find an application for Chris Plant's handy little saying. I don't want to go on too much longer because I do want to allow some time for questions and comments. So,
10 more minutes.
total time?
10 more minutes.
10 more minutes, so I better stop right now if we have questions. Okay, so if there are questions, please, well, there's at least one.
So that lady who didn't pay her I heard of student loans. The government was using the SWAT team as loan sharks.
From the Department of Education. They have a SWAT team at the Department of Education in Washington.
Is that, I mean, like, well, obviously there shouldn't even be a Department of Education, but it's
Bingo.
not even legal in the Department of Education's rules. Are they allowed to use their SWAT team as loan sharks?
Well, you know, I wish somebody had put it to them in those very terms.
I mean, come on, break it
I just think in kind of conventional terms of what you already mentioned. Where is the Department of Education in the Constitution? For that matter, where's the FBI? Where any of these federal police forces, apart from the protective detail guarding the president, and I suppose you could say protecting those in charge of the money system, because that is constitutional as well. But very few examples of that in the Constitution, and the rest of this is all make-believe, except people go to jail because of it and sometimes end up getting really hurt, like at Waco, Ruby Ridge. I'll get into that later if you don't know what I'm referring to, because that was a little bit before you were probably looking at the news. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, what would be an appropriate time to actually rebel against the government?
Well, you know, that was a question that was debated for a long time until we got to the Battle of Lexington. And even at the Battle of Lexington and later that day, the whooping we gave the Brits at Concord Bridge and the serious bloodletting we caused them on their way back to Boston from Concord, I'm not even sure that on that day there were that many people that sat down and said, well, by golly, this is the start of the American War for Independence. All they knew was that it got ugly and they were going to have to be ready for more ugly. And at some point, they obviously looked back and realized that, that was a pretty significant point. So we'll know after we've been there probably, because that was certainly the case of the American War for Independence.
Okay, and the second thing, you asked how do you destroy an A-10? The thing's not always flying. You could get when it landed.
I like the way you think. You're absolutely correct. And the people that fly them have to live somewhere. But we won't pursue that any farther. But you're absolutely correct that these are not invincible, but they do take a little thought. You don't just walk up to an A-10 and say, yes, sir.
Do you think that it will get to the point where we will be unable to rein the government in with the Constitution and will have to resort to rebellion?
That's always a theoretical possibility that we might let things go too far. My concern would be that if we let them go that far, it may be too far. And we may have lost the moment that would have been propitious. What was encouraging to me is that even though our current president was not our first choice, he seems to have a willingness to fight and to stand up and to punch back. And Republicans aren't supposed to do that. And this has really horrified the establishment, both parties, Republicans and Democrats alike. I think it's just absolutely inappropriate for him to do what he does. I'll share something that you may want to take with you, if nothing else. I speak to a number of groups, and one student group that I spoke to in Washington had one young lady in there that came from Fort Worth, Texas. Her pastor is the televangelist. No, I take that back. She knows the lead vocalist in the church headed up by the televangelist James Robeson. And from that source, which is a pretty good source, I would say, she reports, and I've had one or two other reports independently, that the president, as many may have seen, there was a lot of news about the president going to a meeting of evangelicals, ministers, in the last, last August, before the election. As a result of that meeting, I don't know the details, but the long and the short is, this Pastor Robeson, televangelist Robeson, has ended up making weekly calls to the president. Well, candidate Trump and now the president. And it seems as if that's been a kind of discipleship relationship, among other things. So you've got a man who's politically conservative, who's a prominent Christian biblical teacher, who has become a confidant of the President of the United States. Very unexpected. Nobody would have predicted that at all. And yet that seems to be something that's happening. And one way that I think I can tell that there may be something to that, as an outsider looking in, don't have firsthand information of what I'm telling you, but about that time is when the president's potty mouth got cleaned up. He's done a lot of things that continue to offend people, but his mouth has become rather different from what it was even a year ago. So there may be something to what I've heard. Yes, sir.
Just want to add just a little bit more to what you're saying about with James Robeson. So James Robeson was at the Watchman on the Wall conference in D.C. about a month ago, and he gave this exact story about his meeting with the president. And he said back in April 2016, Ben Carson was going to endorse Trump. And he said, before I endorse Trump, one of the prerequisites for me to endorse Trump is for you, Trump, to go meet with James Robeson and have a private meeting. So he agreed to do that. He did it. It was about a 2-hour meeting. And
Good for Carson for doing that.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that.
yeah, and James Robeson said he's never felt more welcomed by anyone in his entire life. And he said they had this wonderful talk, and they were like right in each other's face, talking about the gospel. And they gave each other like a big bear hug at the meeting. And he just said that he was really touched by that whole meeting with Trump, and he seemed to think that he was the real deal after that meeting.
I've been encouraged. I've been encouraged by what I see him doing and saying. I've been encouraged by some of the people that he has around him, particularly Kellyanne Conway. But there are others. There are a lot of others around him. I can't claim to have personal knowledge of the president, but it's these kinds of reports that are consistent. What you're saying fits exactly with what I have heard. So if you pray, then I think you might want to keep this in prayer, that his growth as a Christian, his walk as a Christian, will continue to be strengthened, and that he will have these kinds of wholesome contacts with people like Pastor Robeson, but I'm sure there's many others as well now that are in his orbit. And it's probably just as well for these people that they not be known. You've seen what happens when you're viewed as a friend of Donald Trump. Some people may hold that in high regard. Others may want to shoot you. So if you don't want to walk around in body armor all the time, keep your personal relationship with the president quiet.
All right. All right.